Okay, let's talk about Rome. I mean, it's just endlessly fascinating, isn't it?
Really is.
Not just, the Colosseum and the emperors and all that surface stuff, but the deep story.
Yeah.
Its rise, its incredible power, and of course that big question that never goes away,
Mm-hmm.
its fall.
Mm-hmm.
And it always feels like there are lessons in there for us, for right now. Like we're always sort of looking over our shoulder, watching for those same patterns, those echoes of Rome, maybe in our own world.
That's exactly right. And, that's really what sparked this whole deep dive today. Your interest in this specific piece, an editorial called Echoes of Rome.
Right.
And what's really interesting about it, I think, is that it's not just looking back at history. It takes inspiration from historian Mike Duncan's, specifically insights he shared talking with Theo Vaughn.
Okay, yeah, I remember that conversation.
Yeah,
Duncan's always great on Rome.
he is. But then the editorial does something else. It takes those points Duncan made and filters them through these specific, quite powerful systemic frameworks from William L. Weaver.
Ah, Weaver. Okay, so we're talking about the River of Reality and the other one, the Fortress and the Shifting Sands. Got it.
Exactly, those two.
So our mission here today, it sounds like, is to go a bit deeper than your standard Roman history lesson. We're going to use Rome's story, the whole epic sweep, rise, structure transformation, as a kind of case study,
Case study, yeah.
and look at it through these specific lenses, these Weaver frameworks.
Precisely. The idea is to really dig into the philosophical underpinnings of these frameworks, what makes them tick, and then use that understanding to pull out lessons about how complex societies, like Rome, sure, but also very relevantly, like our own Western culture today, how they actually function, how they grow, how they maintain themselves, and sometimes how they start to, falter or transform.
So less about the emperor's names and battle dates.
Much less. More about the sort of operating system, the underlying dynamics of a civilization, what makes it all together or what makes it come apart.
And for you listening, this is where it gets really practical, maybe. Instead of you having to wade through tons of dense philosophy texts or, volumes of Roman history,
Right.
we're trying to distill the key insights here.
Yeah.
The idea is that understanding these deep patterns, these systemic ways of thinking, as seen in Rome, well, it can give you a really powerful, maybe even a new way to look at the systems you're part of.
Mm-hmm. Every day.
Yeah, your job,
Yeah.
your community, even just trying to make sense of global events. It's about being informed, sure, but maybe with a different kind of depth, a different way of seeing the connections.
It really offers a kind of literacy for navigating complexity. It helps you see the structures beneath the surface noise.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for that. So before we actually, journey back to ancient Rome, let's make sure we really understand the tools we're bringing. These frameworks, the river, the fortress, they offer a pretty unique way of looking at reality itself, don't they?
They really do. They shift your perspective.
Let's start with the river of reality. What's the core idea there?
So Weaver's fundamental argument is that flow, the concept of flow, isn't just something that happens like, water in a river or traffic on a highway.
Okay.
He argues it's something much more fundamental. It's intrinsic to reality at every level, from the tiniest subatomic interactions all the way up to the grand scale of human societies and history. Reality is flow, in his view. It's a dynamic process.
Huh. That actually feels quite intuitive when you put it like that. That sense of constant movement, energy change.
Yeah.
It feels right somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And this is grounded in systems thinking, I take it.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply grounded. Systems thinking is all about, moving beyond looking at things as isolated parts.
Right, seeing the connections.
Seeing the connections, the relationships, the patterns that emerge from those interactions. And critically, the feedback loops, how the output of one part of the system circles back to influence its own input or other parts. It's about seeing the whole interconnected web.
And those nested hierarchies that seem to pop up everywhere.
Yeah.
Systems within systems within systems.
Exactly. That's a key concept. Think cells making tissues, tissues making organs, organs making an organism, or individuals forming groups, groups forming organizations, organizations forming societies. Weaver calls these patterns isomorphic.
Isomorphic.
Meaning they have similar shapes, similar underlying rules or structures, even across vastly different domains. Like the branching pattern of a river delta might look similar to the branching of blood vessels or a corporate org chart.
Okay, interesting. Common shapes.
Common shapes, common principles. And crucially, at each higher level of these hierarchies, new properties emerge. Things that you just couldn't predict by looking only at the pieces on the level below.
Right, emergence, like consciousness emerging from neurons or Life from chemistry?
Precisely. Life is more than just the chemicals it's made of. Consciousness is more than just electrical signals. And Weaver argues that reality itself builds up through these emergent hierarchical layers or tiers, all driven by fundamental flows.
Okay, so if reality is flow and it builds in layers,
hmm
what is actually flowing? What are the absolute basics? Is that where this EMI trinity comes in?
Yes, exactly. The standard systems model, as Weaver lays it out, starts with these three fundamental constituents, E, M, and I,
Right.
energy, material, and information.
EMI, right.
And he uses this neat analogy of the RGB primary colors, red, green, blue. Just like those three colors combine to create the entire spectrum of visible light, he suggests E, M, and I combine to constitute everything in reality.
Okay, so E is energy,
Right.
red, the capacity to do work, the sort of raw potential.
That's it, the fundamental capacity for action, for change. The most basic layer.
Then M, material. Green, that's the actual stuff, right?
Yeah.
The substance, the matter we interact with.
Right. And interestingly, he posits that material actually emerges from energy. It's like structured or concentrated energy. Think, Einstein's EMC. Energy and mass are fundamentally interchangeable. So energy is deeper. Material arises from it.
Okay, that makes sense. Energy first, then material emerges. So what about I? Information's blue. What is that in this model?
Information is about order, pattern, structure, arrangement. It's not just stuff. It's how the stuff is organized. It emerges when energy and material come together in specific non-random ways.
Okay.
The classic example Weaver uses is a pile of bricks versus a house. The pile is just energy, potential, and material. Bricks, same material. But arrange those bricks according to a specific plan, add the structure, the
Yeah.
order.
You get a house.
Exactly. And that structure, that blueprint, is the information. It's what gives the matter form, function, meaning. It transforms the pile of stuff into something useful and coherent.
I like that. Information isn't just raw data points. It's the organization of data, the pattern that gives it meaning.
Precisely. So E, M, and I, energy, material, and information, are the three fundamental things that flow and interact within any open system, any system that exchanges with its environment.
Okay, got the building blocks. And these flows, you said they manifest across different tiers of reality, like levels.
Yes, he lays out a hierarchy of tiers. Tier 1 is the most basic, the physical world. This is the domain of physics. Flow here is pretty literal. It's the movement of energy, material, and information according to stable, predictable physical laws.
So things like motion, velocity, acceleration, basic mechanics.
Basic mechanics, yes. But also things like fluid dynamics, how liquids and gases flow, wave propagation, how energy moves through a medium, even things like vector fields, which map the speed and direction of forces or flows across space, and the concept of flux, the rate at which something like heat or mass or energy flows across a specific area.
So this is the stable backdrop, the stage where everything else happens.
Exactly. Tier 1 provides the reliable, predictable canvas. Its laws are consistent, which allows for higher levels of complexity to build upon it.
Okay, predictable physical flows. Then building on that, the source mentioned a profound emergent leap. That takes us to Tier 2, biological systems.
And it really is a profound leap, because life doesn't just get pushed around by physical flows. Life actively manages and organizes flow.
Oh, okay. It takes control.
It takes control, exactly. A biological system is essentially a self-maintaining, often self-replicating flow management system.
Like a single cell, maybe.
A single cell is the perfect microcosm. Think about its membrane. It's not just a wall, it's a dynamic boundary. It actively controls what comes in energy, materials, and what goes out waste products. It receives information signals from its environment and responds. It's constantly managing internal flows to maintain a stable internal state homeostasis.
Right, keeping things balanced inside despite changes outside.
Exactly. And just like we saw with the general principle of hierarchy, biological life shows this nested structure too, doesn't it? Cells group together to form tissues.
Tissues form organs.
Organs form organisms. It's that same isomorphic pattern of systems building on systems.
And each organ seems like a specialized department for managing certain kinds of flows within the larger organism, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. The heart is a pump managing blood flow. And blood carries energy, materials like oxygen and nutrients, and information in the form of hormones.
Yeah. Lungs manage gas flow, air in, CO2 out.
The nervous system is all about managing information flow. Those electrical and chemical signals coordinating everything. The digestive system manages the flow of nutrients coming in and waste going out. Each organ is like a specialized flow management department, highly optimized for its job.
And the whole organism, then, is the integrated system of all these systems, managing all those flows together.
Yes, integrating all those organ-level flows. And at this level, the whole organism, new properties emerge again. Things like basic consciousness, or at least awareness, a unified response to the environment, instincts, drives. The organism orchestrates all the internal flows to survive, thrive, and interact with the world.
So you see the complexity building? Physical flow, then life-managing flow, then the whole organism integrating those managed flows for survival.
Step by step, layer by layer.
Okay. And the next really huge leap, going from just being a complex biological organism to, well, us. The self-aware human mind, language, abstract thought, culture, values. That's tier 3, right? The sociocultural world.
Exactly. Another massive emergent leap built upon the biological tier. And Weaver argues that within this sociocultural realm, there's another isomorphic hierarchy, another cascade of flows that build on each other in a necessary sequence.
Okay, a cascade within tier 3. And the source says it starts with science. That seems foundational.
Yes, level 1 in this sociocultural cascade is science, and its core study is truth, specifically empirical, verifiable truth about the world. Its output is data, validated facts.
Okay.
When this data is organized, shared, and agreed upon, it generates the fundamental flow of information for society. This shared, stable understanding of how the world actually works based on evidence and reason is the bedrock. You need it to build anything reliable, to understand cause and effect, to make predictions. If a society can't agree on basic facts, everything built on top becomes incredibly shaky.
Makes sense. You need a shared map of reality first. So information is the base. What builds directly on that?
Level 2, art. Now, art here is defined quite broadly. It's not just paintings and sculptures. Its domain is the study of membership.
Membership. How so?
How things fit together, how individuals connect to form a group, how disparate elements can be integrated into a coherent, meaningful whole. Its output is beauty, but beauty in a systemic sense, not just aesthetics, but coherence, integration, resonance. It's the currency that connects things.
Ah, okay.
And this generates the flow of connection. This is the shared identity, the sense of belonging, the social fabric, the emotional ties that bind people together into a community or a culture. You need the flow of information as a base, but art builds on that to create the feeling of being part of something larger. Think national myths, shared symbols, rituals, music.
Got it. So from understanding facts, info, to feeling connected as a group, connection, what gives that connection structure and, like, moral direction?
That brings us to level 3, religion and ethics. This domain studies value, what's important, what's good, what should we strive for, what's forbidden. Its output is judgment, not necessarily negative judgment, but the ability to prioritize, to make distinctions based on value.
Okay, defining what matters.
Exactly. And this establishes the flow of hierarchy. Not necessarily a rigid social hierarchy, but a shared understanding of what's considered important, what principles guide behavior. A shared moral compass, if you will.
And why is that so critical?
Because, Weaver argues, this shared flow of hierarchy is what enables large-scale social trust.
Trust. How does a hierarchy of values lead to trust?
Because when people share, or at least understand and generally abide by, a common set of ethical principles and values, their behavior becomes more predictable. You can interact with a stranger with some baseline expectation of how they'll behave, what rules they'll follow. This shared understanding of what matters and how we do things makes cooperation possible between people who don't know each other personally on a massive scale. It builds trust on the foundation of shared connection, which was built on shared information.
Wow. Okay, so information provides the map, connection builds the group identity, hierarchy ethics provides the shared rules and enables trust. What emerges once you have that large-scale trust?
Level 4, economics. Economic studies exchange the transfer of value in all its forms. Its output is markets the arenas, formal or informal, where these exchanges happen.
Yeah.
This generates the massive, complex flow of commerce, the movement of goods, services, capital, ideas, labor, all of it. And this level of complex, widespread economic activity is only really possible because of the trust established by the shared hierarchy. People need to trust contracts, property rights, currency, future commitments to engage in complex trade and investment, especially with people they don't know. Commerce builds incredible complexity, specialization, and potentially wealth.
Okay, so commerce generates huge complexity. And all that complexity, all that wealth, all those interactions, They need to be managed somehow, right? That sounds like politics.
Exactly. Level 5, politics.
Yeah.
Politics in this framework studies force, but not just physical force. It includes influence, authority, power, the ability to make collective decisions and enforce them. Its output is action, collective decisions, laws, policies, resource allocation. And this generates the flow of governance. This is the system a society uses to manage internal conflicts, often arising from commerce, mobilize resources for shared goals, like defense or infrastructure, set direction, and interact with other societies or the external environment. Politics essentially has to grapple with and try to steer the immense complexity unleashed by the flow of commerce, using the foundations laid by the lower flows.
So let me see if I've got this sociocultural cascade right.
Yeah.
It's science generating information, then art generating connection, then religion ethics generating hierarchy and trust, then economics generating commerce, and finally politics generating governance to manage it all.
That's the sequence Weaver lays out. Each level emerges from and depends on the ones below it. A breakdown in a lower level inevitably impacts the stability and function of the levels above it.
That's a really clear model. But is that the top? Or is there something above politics?
There is, not just another level in the cascade, but Weaver describes it as a kind of transcendental metasystem that oversees the whole thing, philosophy.
Philosophy. Okay, what's its role? What does it study?
It studies wisdom, which is different from just knowing facts, information, or being skilled at exchange, commerce, or wielding power, governance. Wisdom is about holistic understanding. It's about grasping how all these different systems and flows interact, understanding their underlying principles, their purpose, their limitations.
Seeing the bigger picture.
Seeing the bigger picture, exactly. And its output is frameworks. Conceptual models, mental tools that help us make sense of reality, ourselves, and our societies. Things like the scientific method itself, different political ideologies, moral philosophies. Even the systems frameworks we're discussing right now are outputs of philosophy. It provides the blueprints for how we think about thinking.
Blueprints for thought. Wow. Okay, so where does consciousness fit into all this? Human consciousness, self-awareness.
Weaver argues that's the ultimate emergent flow. Consciousness, especially the kind of critical, self-aware consciousness that humans possess, emerges when philosophical frameworks, ways of understanding a whole system, begin to permeate a system, whether that system is an individual mind or an entire society.
So when a system starts to use philosophy to understand itself.
Yes. When it moves beyond just operating according to the lower flows and starts to develop the capacity for critical self-reflection, for understanding why it operates the way it does, for questioning its own assumptions and values, that's when consciousness in this systemic sense emerges. It's like the system becomes aware of itself as a system.
Reality looking at itself, like you said.
Exactly. And this is incredibly important because it creates a crucial feedback loop. Consciousness allows the system, a person, a society, to intentionally modify itself. It's no longer just reacting. It can use philosophical understanding to analyze its own structures, laws, economy, values, and make deliberate choices to change them based on some reasoned concept of better or wiser.
So it gives us agency, the ability to steer the flows.
Precisely. It's the capacity for directed change based on understanding. It's why, as Weaver sometimes points out, the highest academic degree in almost any field is a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy. It signifies a level of mastery that includes understanding the deepest foundations and purposes of that field, not just the technical skills.
Okay, wow. That river of reality framework is huge. It really lays out a comprehensive map, building complexity from physics all the way up to philosophical self-awareness and agency. It definitely gives you a different way to look at, well, everything.
It really does. It provides a structure for thinking about how complexity arises and how different aspects of reality are interconnected. And the second framework, the fortress and the shifting sands, fits alongside it really well. It zooms in on a particular kind of vulnerability that often develops in these highly complex systems as they mature through those flows.
Right, the fortress. This idea that complex systems can feel, and often are, incredibly strong and resilient, like a fortress.
Yes. And the source suggests this strength often comes from a particular kind of internal structure. It draws on the work of Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate, and his concept of nearly decomposable systems, NDS for short.
Nearly decomposable systems. Okay, sounds a bit technical. What's the basic idea?
It's actually pretty intuitive once you get it. NDS are systems where the connections inside the components or modules are much, much stronger and faster than the connections between the different components. Think of well-defined parts that mostly manage their own business but interact with other parts in limited, specific ways.
Okay, can you give some examples? Make it concrete.
Sure. A classic example is a well-drilled military unit, like a platoon. The soldiers within the squad coordinate very tightly, very quickly, strong internal links. Their communication and coordination with other platoons might be slower, more formalized, weaker intercomponent links.
Okay, yeah.
Or think of a modern car engine. You have distinct systems: fuel injection, ignition, cooling, exhaust. Each is highly optimized internally, but they interact with each other through specific, relatively narrow interfaces. They're nearly decomposable.
Or like software built with modules or microservices.
Perfect example. Different parts of the program run almost independently, handling specific tasks, and they communicate through defined APIs, application programming interfaces. Strong inside, weaker between.
Got it. And the strength of this NDS structure is that resilience you mentioned.
Exactly. Two main strengths. First, resilience through modularity. If one component fails or has a problem, the issue is often contained within that module. It's less likely to cascade and bring down the entire system immediately.
Okay, localized failure.
Right. And second, efficiency within the modules. Because each component can focus intensely on its own internal operations without constantly having to coordinate every little thing with every other component, it can become highly specialized and optimized for its specific task.
So these systems become really good at what they do, especially under predictable conditions. They can weather the storms they were designed for?
Precisely. They become internally optimized, robust against expected stresses. They build strong walls, the fortress.
Okay, strong, resilient to known threats, internally efficient. Sounds great. So where's the catch? What's the vulnerability? What are the shifting sands?
The vulnerability usually isn't the big, obvious storm that the fortress was explicitly built to withstand. The real danger, the source argues, is the slow, subtle, often almost imperceptible change in the environment underneath the fortress. The ground itself is shifting, but the fortress is built solid, optimized for the ground as it used to be.
So the system doesn't get smashed down from the outside? It fails because it doesn't realize the world around it, the context it exists in, has changed.
That's the core idea, the very optimization that made it strong and efficient when the environment was stable, that intense inward focus, the strong internal connections, the well-defined modules that becomes its fatal flaw when the external environment drifts significantly.
Because it's perfectly adapted, but to a reality that no longer exists.
Exactly. It becomes calcified, rigid, brilliantly designed for yesterday's world, making it dangerously mismatched to today's.
And the root cause of this failure to adapt is
An underdeveloped, ignored, or perhaps even deliberately suppressed sensory apparatus. The system isn't built to effectively sense what's happening outside its walls, or it gets input but filters it out, or it senses the change but is unwilling or unable to change its internal structure in response. It prefers the comfort of its optimized routines.
the source used a great analogy for this, the martial arts kata.
Yeah, that's a really clarifying one. A kata is a preset sequence of movements practiced over and over until it's automatic. It's a highly optimized NDS response, designed to defend against a specific, imagined, predictable attack.
Right. If the attacker does exactly what the kata expects,
Then the defender's response is incredibly fast, efficient, powerful. The fortress holds.
but real fights aren't like that. Real opponents are unpredictable.
Precisely. A skilled opponent, facing someone relying too heavily on rote kata, might use a feint. They'll start an attack that triggers the defender's practiced, optimized kata response.
Huh?
But because the defender is now locked into executing that internal script, not actively sensing and adapting to the opponent's actual movements in real time, the attacker changes their angle after triggering the response. They exploit an opening created by the defender's commitment to the now irrelevant routine.
So the kata itself isn't bad, but relying only on it without awareness and flexibility is the danger. You stop sensing, you just react based on the old program.
Exactly. You become, as the source vividly puts it, like a robot, flawlessly executing a program that doesn't match the current reality. The optimization becomes a trap.
That's a chilling thought. And you see this in other areas too, like the programmer example.
Absolutely. Programmers develop toolkits, libraries, establish frameworks. These are their optimized NDS solutions for recurring problems. They're efficient for known tasks.
Makes sense. You use the tools you know work.
Right. But the trap is when a new kind of problem arises, or the context changes, but the programmer automatically reaches for the old, familiar, optimized framework without really stopping to sense whether the underlying nature of the situation has shifted.
So they build something elegant internally, but it doesn't actually fit the new requirements.
Exactly. The code might be beautiful according to the old framework's logic, but it's mismatched to the actual demands of the new environment. Like the martial artist, the programmer failed to adequately sense the shifting sands before deploying their internal fortress of code.
Okay, I see the pattern. And the source takes us right up to Tier 3 systems, to human cultures, societies.
Yes, arguing that cultures themselves can function like these fortresses. They build incredibly strong internal coherence through shared narratives, norms, values, institutions, accepted ways of knowing things. These create powerful internal bonds.
Like the glue holding society together.
Definitely. But they can also develop weak or resistant external couplings. Information or perspectives that challenge the established worldview, that come from outside the tribe or don't fit the dominant narrative, often get filtered out, dismissed, ridiculed, or actively suppressed.
And that internal cohesion feels like strength,
Right.
unity.
It absolutely is strength, especially for maintaining stability and collective action if the surrounding environment remains relatively stable. But therein lies the danger Weaver points out. If the external world does change significantly, maybe due to new technologies or shifts in global economics or evolving social values elsewhere or climate change or new geopolitical pressures, then that very internal coherence can become a source of dangerous blindness.
So?
Because the system's strength in maintaining internal agreement, in enforcing conformity to the established norms and beliefs, now actively works against sensing and integrating crucial information from the outside that signals the need for adaptation. Dissent is quashed, inconvenient data is ignored, challenging ideas are dismissed as foreign or wrong.
Leading to that calcification we talked about. The society becomes rigid, disconnected from the changing reality outside its borders or its echo chamber.
Exactly. And the potential consequences are stagnation, growing irrelevance, internal decay, or eventually some kind of disruptive crisis or collapse when the pressure from the unacknowledged external changes finally overwhelms the brittle internal structures. It's the fortress pattern again. Optimize internally, neglect external sensing, fail to adapt, become vulnerable.
This ties back directly to that fundamental process in the river of reality model, doesn't it? About how information actually flows.
It connects perfectly. Remember the sequence: environment, data, transducers, sensors, information, model, knowledge.
Right.
If your sensors, the transducers, are faulty or biased, or you deliberately ignore the data they pick up from the environment, or you filter the resulting information through a rigid, outdated model, then your knowledge of the world becomes flawed. You're essentially flying blind.
You're operating your beautifully optimized fortress without an accurate picture of what's happening outside the walls. It reminds me of those basic safety rules. Keep your head on a swivel, scan your surroundings.
It's the same principle applied to complex systems. And sensing isn't just passive reception of data. The source calls it the lifeblood of adaptation. Why? Because accurate, timely information about the environment is the raw material that enables meaningful choice.
Ah, okay. Not just reacting, but choosing.
Yes. Those rote, optimized NDS responses, the kata-like routines, they aren't sufficient when the environment is dynamic, unpredictable, or fundamentally changing. True resilience, the kind that allows for long-term survival and flourishing, requires agency. It requires the capacity to choose a response based on fresh, relevant information from the outside, not just defaulting to ingrained patterns that might be dangerously obsolete.
Okay, so let me try to synthesize the core lesson here. NDS structures give you internal strength, stability, efficiency. That's the fortress.
Yeah.
It's great for handling things you expect. But that internal focus, that optimization, becomes a massive vulnerability if it leads you to ignore or fail to sense or fail to adapt to changes in the external environment, the shifting sands.
That's it, exactly. An inward-looking system, no matter how elegant or powerful its internal workings, risks becoming, as the source puts it, that beautifully constructed relic, perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists.
Like the martial artist stuck mid-kata while the opponent hits from a different angle, or the programmer applying an old solution to a new problem, or the culture clinging to traditions that no longer serve it in a changed world.
They all illustrate that core danger, optimizing the inside while losing touch with the outside. The source suggests the ideal isn't to abandon internal structure, but to build an open NDS.
Open NDS, what does that mean?
It means a system that maintains its beneficial internal structures, its modularity, its efficiency, but it also consciously and continuously invests in its sensors. It actively gathers and makes sense of information flowing in from the external environment, those flows of energy, material, and information. And crucially, it retains the agency, the flexibility, the willingness to change its internal structures and responses based on what it learns from the outside.
So the big takeaway from the Fortress and Shifting Sands is about balance then.
Absolutely. You need internal coherence and strength, the fortress, but you absolutely must balance that with robust, ongoing external awareness sensing the sands. The key is ensuring, as the source says, that our fortresses have windows, and maybe even more importantly, that we are willing to look through them and act upon what they reveal.
Wow. Okay. Those two frameworks, the river mapping the flows and emergence, the fortress highlighting the adaptation challenge, they're really powerful lenses. Now let's finally do it. Let's turn these lenses onto Rome. The Echoes of Rome editorial uses this approach, right? Using the river reality to trace Rome's development, seeing it as this complex system evolving through the health of those different sociocultural flows.
That's right. Instead of just a timeline of emperors and wars, it views Roman history as a story where the integrity, the balance, the health of each of those flows, information, connection, hierarchy, commerce, governance, really determine the civilization's stability, its success, and ultimately its transformation.
Okay, so Rome's story, through this lens, starts with establishing that foundational flow of information, which for them was less about pure science and more about engineering.
Exactly. They weren't philosophers of nature like the Greeks, perhaps, but the Romans were absolute masters of practical engineering and the organization of information needed for large-scale projects. Think about their incredible road network.
Yeah, legendary. All roads lead to Rome.
And those roads weren't just for marching legions. They were conduits for information, for trade goods, for administrative messages. Same with their aqueducts, bringing reliable water, their civil engineering bridges, public buildings, using that amazing Roman concrete. These weren't just impressive structures. They were actively creating a more stable, predictable physical environment. They were managing the Tier 1 flows of material and energy to build a reliable platform upon which higher-level social complexity could emerge.
That makes sense. The roads themselves were like a circulatory system for the empire, carrying information, military power, economic goods.
Absolutely. And they consciously used other tools for information flow, too. Think about Roman coinage. It wasn't just money, it was a medium for mass communication.
How so?
The emperor's image, slogans, symbols of victories stamped on every coin circulated throughout the empire. It was a way to standardize the message, reinforce imperial authority, disseminate propaganda to even illiterate populations across vast distances.
Huh? Never thought of coins that way. But the source also notes limitations here, right?
Yeah.
This information flow wasn't exactly open or objective.
Definitely not. For the most part, access to detailed information, literacy itself, was confined to the elite. The average person's information sphere was much more localized. News came via traders, soldiers returning home, local officials, word of mouth. And even the official history, written by historians like Livy or Tacitus, often had an agenda. They were often more like moral storytellers, crafting narratives to illustrate Roman virtues or vices, rather than purely objective chroniclers trying to record facts neutrally. The truth was often shaped.
Okay, so they built this impressive, if somewhat controlled, physical and informational bedrock. Then on top of that came the flow of connection, using art and myth.
Yes, building on that stable platform. Think about their origin stories, Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf, the legends of the 7 early kings. As the source points out, these weren't meant to be taken as literal, factual history.
Right, more like foundational myths.
Exactly. They were powerful narratives that defined Roman identity. They answered the question, what kind of people are we? What are our origins? What values do we stand for? They used grand public spectacles, the games in the Colosseum, triumphal parades, and shared religious rituals to create powerful, unifying collective experiences.
And their art and architecture too, right? Those massive temples, arches, statues.
So,
It feels like it was all designed to impress and unify.
absolutely. The iconography, the sheer scale and grandeur it served to weave together people from incredibly diverse backgrounds, from Britain to Syria, into a single overarching identity. It created that powerful sense of being Roman, a feeling of membership that could transcend local languages, customs, and gods. This flow of connection, this shared identity, was the essential social glue holding that vast multicultural empire together.
Okay, so the infrastructure and information flow provided the platform. And art and myth built the shared identity, the connection. And
Mhm.
that shared identity was then given structure, order, and moral grounding by the flow of hierarchy through Roman religion and values.
Right, giving shape and meaning to the connection. Roman religion was fascinating because it was so deeply interwoven with the state itself. In the Republic, the highest political officials, the consuls, were also the chief religious figures. Their job wasn't just governing, it was maintaining the pax deorum, the peace or favor of the gods, through meticulously performed public rituals and sacrifices. Religion was a civic duty.
And they had that huge pantheon of gods. And they were pretty flexible about adding new ones, weren't they? Syncretism.
Yes, their polytheism and syncretism, their willingness to incorporate the gods of conquered peoples into their own pantheon, or identify foreign gods with Roman ones was actually a key strength. It was a tool for cultural integration, a way to make conquered peoples feel included rather than just suppressed, smoothing the flow of connection.
And alongside the gods, they had a very clear set of core values they emphasized.
Oh, yes. Values like pietas, which is more than just piety. It includes duty to family, state, and gods. Gravitas, a kind of seriousness of purpose, self-control. And virtus, originally meaning manly courage and excellence, especially in a military context, but evolving to include broader civic virtue. These values form the core of the Roman moral hierarchy.
And later philosophies like Stoicism came in and reinforced some of that. Duty, acceptance of your role.
Exactly. Stoicism, particularly popular among the Roman elite like Seneca or Emperor Marcus Aurelius, but also influencing figures like the former slave Epictetus, emphasized reason, virtue, living in accordance with nature, and calmly accepting one's fate and duty within the larger order. It provided a philosophical backbone that reinforced the existing social and moral hierarchy.
And the crucial outcome of establishing this clear, widely shared flow of hierarchy, this system of values and religious practice, was
It enabled that critical element, large-scale social trust. When people broadly shared or respected the same core values, the same understanding of duties and obligations, the same rituals connecting them to the divine and the state, they could interact with relative predictability and confidence, even with strangers from distant provinces. This trust, built on hierarchy, which was built on connection, which was built on information, was the necessary precondition for the next explosion of complexity.
which was the flow of commerce, the Roman economy.
Exactly. With a stable infrastructure, a shared identity, and a foundation of social trust enabled by shared values and predictable governance, at least ideally, Rome became an unprecedented engine for commerce.
The famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Right, enforced by the might of the legions across that vast territory connected by those incredible roads and sea lanes, it created the largest, most stable, and relatively secure free trade zone the ancient world had ever known. Goods, resources, people, ideas, and immense wealth flowed from the provinces towards the center, towards Rome itself, on a scale never seen before.
But this is where the source, echoing Mike Duncan's analysis, really flies the beginning of the serious problems, right? The seeds of decay were sown within this very success. Runaway economic inequality started to take hold.
Yes, this is a critical point. The sheer success of the flow of commerce began to destabilize the other flows that had made it possible. The vast wealth generated wasn't distributed anything close to evenly.
How did that play out?
You had the rise of enormous aristocratic estates, the latifundia, often worked by vast numbers of slaves captured in wars or by indebted tenant farmers. These huge commercial farms could produce cash crops much more cheaply than the traditional small family-run farms.
And those small farmers,
Yeah.
they were the backbone of the early republic, right? Both economically and militarily.
Exactly. The ideal Roman citizen was a small landowner who served in the army when called upon. Land ownership was often a prerequisite for military service and full political rights. But these small farmers increasingly couldn't compete with the economies of scale of the latifundia. Many fell into debt, were forced to sell their land to the wealthy aristocrats, and drifted into the cities, becoming part of a large, landless urban proletariat, or stayed in the countryside as impoverished laborers.
So this wasn't just an economic issue isolated over here. It had massive ripple effects through the whole system.
Profound effects. It fundamentally broke the traditional link between land ownership, citizenship, and military service, the citizen-soldier model that the Republic's strength had been built on,
Undermining the military structure.
and the social structure and the political structure. If the state could no longer rely on citizen soldiers providing their own equipment and serving out of duty, it had to turn to other solutions. This directly eroded the integrity of the hierarchy flow, traditional values, and put immense strain on the governance flow.
Which brings us neatly to that final sociocultural flow, governance politics. Its primary job in this model is to manage the immense complexity generated by commerce and the demands of military security.
Right. And in the early to mid-republic, the political system, while certainly not perfectly equitable, had mechanisms that linked political power and military responsibility relatively closely. As the source notes, drawing on Duncan, there weren't really chicken hawks political leaders urging war who hadn't themselves served or wouldn't lead armies. Command in war was a path to political power, and vice versa. Duty was central.
But the corruption coming from the other flows, particularly that massive economic inequality and the breakdown of the citizen-soldier model, started to poison the political system.
Absolutely. As land ownership concentrated and the traditional recruitment pool dried up, generals like Marius reformed the army. They started recruiting landless citizens, promising them land and spoils upon retirement paid for by the general, often not the state.
So the soldiers' loyalty shifted.
It shifted dramatically. From loyalty to the Senate and people of Rome, SPQR, the abstract state, to loyalty to the specific general who recruited them, paid them, fought alongside them, and promised them their future. This was effectively the privatization of military force. Generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and ultimately Julius Caesar commanded huge, battle-hardened armies loyal primarily to them.
And the source points out that after Rome finally defeated its great rival, Carthage, that external threat that had united the elites disappeared.
And with no unifying external enemy, the internal tensions, fueled by economic inequality and personal ambition backed by private armies, exploded. The Roman elite turned on itself,
Leading to that horrific century of civil wars.
Yes, from Marius and Sulla through Caesar and Pompey to Octavian and Antony. The political system of the Republic, designed for a smaller city-state perhaps, or at least a society with a different economic and military structure, simply could not cope with the stresses generated by its own imperial success and the resulting distortions in the flows of commerce and hierarchy. The system was optimized for an older reality and couldn't handle the new pressures.
Which ultimately destroyed the Republic and led to the establishment of the empire under Augustus Octavian.
Exactly. The empire, in one sense, was a response to the failure of the Republic's governance structure. It was a move towards authoritarianism, concentrating power control over all the flows, really. Information, connection, hierarchy, commerce, and especially governance and military force into the hands of one man, the emperor. It was an attempt, initially successful, to suppress the internal chaos and reimpose order on a system that had spun out of control.
So, looking at Rome through the river of reality really highlights how interconnected everything is. You can't just mess with one flow, like letting economic inequality run rampant, without it having potentially catastrophic consequences for the others, like politics and social trust.
It's a powerful illustration. The long-term health and stability of a complex society seems to depend crucially on maintaining some kind of balance and integrity across all these different sociocultural flows, from the most basic shared information right up to how wealth is distributed and power is managed. Breakdown in one area inevitably stresses the others.
Okay, that gives us a really rich picture of Rome's rise and structure as a system. Now let's shift lenses again and look at the later period, the fall or maybe transformation of the Western Empire, using the fortress and the shifting sands framework.
Right, because by the time we get to the late Roman Empire, say the 4th and 5th centuries AD, it had definitely become a fortress. It was an incredibly complex, highly optimized system. Its administrative bureaucracy, its legal structures, its military doctrines, its road network, its cultural identity. These had been honed and refined over centuries. It was incredibly resilient and sophisticated in dealing with the kinds of problems it knew how to deal with, the kinds of threats it had faced before.
It was a nearly decomposable system that had perfected its internal workings based on past experience, robust against known stresses.
Absolutely. A magnificent, if perhaps increasingly rigid, NDS. But the problem, as the Fortress framework predicts, wasn't necessarily a failure of its existing strengths against familiar challenges. The problem was the shifting sands.
The environment changing underneath it in ways it wasn't set up to notice or handle.
Exactly. Slow, subtle, but ultimately profound changes were happening in the world outside the empire's direct control, particularly on its frontiers.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
A key one, highlighted in the sources drawing on Duncan, was the changing nature of the barbarian groups beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. For centuries, Rome had faced numerous, relatively small, often mutually hostile Germanic tribes. They could be managed using traditional tactics. divide and conquer, playing one tribe off against another, punitive expeditions, hiring them as mercenaries.
The standard Roman playbook.
Right. But over time, partly in response to Roman pressure and influence itself, these smaller groups began to coalesce. They formed larger, more powerful, more politically sophisticated confederations. Think of the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Alemanni. These weren't just scattered warbands anymore.
They were becoming major political and military players in their own right.
Yes. And crucially, their relationship with Rome was often more complex than simple hostility. As Duncan points out, many of these groups didn't necessarily want to destroy the empire. They were often deeply impressed by Roman civilization. They wanted in. They wanted access to Roman land, Roman wealth, Roman status, sometimes seeking refuge from other groups pushing from further east, like the Huns. They wanted integration, or at least a recognized place within or alongside the Roman system.
So the nature of the barbarian problem was fundamentally changing. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about diplomacy, integration, managing large migrating populations.
Precisely. It required a different kind of sensing, a different kind of response from the Roman fortress than simply military repulsion. But the Roman leadership, often isolated in imperial courts far from the frontiers, like Milan or Ravenna, not Rome itself anymore, frequently seemed dangerously blind to these nuances.
Their sensory apparatuses failed them. Or they chose to ignore the signals.
It seems like a combination. The source describes the Roman elite as being beset by their own myopia and prejudice. They often continue to view these complex, evolving groups through the old lens of simply barbarian threats to be defeated or managed, rather than seeing them as potential partners or sources of new manpower, or even just as crucial indicators of how the wider world was changing. They failed to update their model of reality.
They kept applying the old, optimized fortresses responses to a new, shifting sands situation.
Exactly. They struggled to see the Goths, for instance, not just as enemies, but as complex political entities with their own internal dynamics, needs, and ambitions, entities that might, if handled differently, even become a source of strength for the empire, which was facing demographic decline and recruitment problems.
And this blownness, this failure to sense and adapt, had catastrophic consequences. The famous sack of Rome by Alaric and the Goths in 410 AD is used as a prime example of this, right?
Yes, the source really emphasizes this point, building on Duncan's interpretation. Alaric's sack wasn't some surprise invasion by an unknown outside force that simply overwhelmed Roman defenses. It was the culmination of a long-fraught political negotiation that failed spectacularly.
Who were Alaric and the Goths in this context?
They weren't strangers. Alaric had been a commander of Gothic auxiliary troops within the Roman army. His people, the Visigoths, had been living inside Roman territory for decades, initially allowed in as refugees. They had served Rome, fought Rome's battles. They understood the system from the inside.
So they were basically disgruntled contractors or employees.
In a way, yes. Alaric and his followers felt they weren't getting the recognition, the land, the payments, the status they deserved or had been promised by the Roman authorities. The sack of Rome wasn't an act of wanton destruction aimed at ending the empire. It was more like an extreme, violent form of political protest or negotiation tactic. Alaric was trying desperately to force the inflexible, distrustful Roman elite in Ravenna to take him seriously, to integrate his people properly into the imperial system on fair terms.
And the Roman fortress couldn't handle that kind of complex internal-external negotiation.
It seems not. The leadership was paralyzed by internal politics, prejudice against barbarians, and perhaps a fundamental inability to adapt its structures and mindset. They failed to sense the desperation and the power of Alaric's position. They reneged on deals, and ultimately their inflexibility led directly to the Goths marching on and sacking the symbolic heart of the empire. It was a failure of sensing, a failure of adaptation, a failure of governance stemming from calcification, not just a military defeat.
So the fall wasn't a sudden collapse, but more like this slow crumbling or transformation driven by the fortress becoming blind and brittle.
That's the picture the Fortress and Shifting Sands framework paints. The late Roman Empire became that beautifully constructed relic, internally complex and optimized for a past environment, but increasingly disconnected from the shifting realities outside and even inside its borders.
Its flows became brittle, like connection and hierarchy couldn't stretch to include new peoples.
Exactly. The system lost its elasticity. The shared identity connection became too rigid to easily incorporate large groups like the Goths. The established hierarchies social, political, military, couldn't adapt to new power dynamics. The governance structures, optimized for projecting power outward and managing provinces, struggled to cope with internal decay, economic stress, and the complex new realities of migration and border negotiation.
The fortress crumbled not because the walls were weak, but because it had no windows or refused to look out of them.
That's a powerful summary of the argument, and it really underscores how even the most sophisticated, historically successful system can ultimately fail or transform if it loses that crucial capacity to sense its changing environment and adapt its internal structures accordingly. The danger of focusing only on internal optimization while ignoring the shifting sands beneath your feet.
Okay. This brings us right up to the present day, doesn't it? The whole point of the Echoes of Rome editorial and this discussion is that this isn't just fascinating ancient history. These patterns, seen through these systemic lenses, have direct relevance for us now.
Absolutely. The conclusion of the editorial makes that connection unavoidable and explicit. It suggests that we, today, in the modern West, also live in a kind of highly optimized civilization, a fortress, perhaps, of incredible technological sophistication and economic power.
Yeah, you can definitely see it that way.
And it points out that we seem to be grappling with disturbingly similar kinds of systemic issues that plagued Rome, especially in its later stages.
What parallels does it draw specifically?
Things like runaway economic inequality putting immense stress on the social fabric and political stability, a deeply polarized, often toxic and gridlocked political environment, governance flow struggling, a potential crisis of shared identity and common ground, a fraying of the flow of connection, and all this happening while the global sands are shifting incredibly rapidly around us technologically, economically, geopolitically, environmentally.
It certainly feels familiar. History doesn't repeat, maybe, but as the saying goes, it rhymes. Duncan often implies that, too.
It does seem to rhyme. And Rome's story, interpreted through these frameworks, offers some potent systemic health lessons for our own time.
What's the core lesson from the river of reality perspective applied today?
That the underlying strength and resilience of our society depend on the health, integrity, and balance of all those interconnected sociocultural flows. We need reliable information, strong social connections, a broadly shared ethical framework that fosters trust, an economic system that provides opportunity without fatal levels of inequality, and governance capable of managing complexity and acting for the common good. Weakness or corruption in one flow inevitably puts strain on the others.
And the core lesson from the fortress and the shifting sands.
That even the most powerful, technologically advanced, internally optimized system is deeply vulnerable, perhaps even doomed if it becomes blind to the changing environment and loses the capacity or the will to adapt. Rome's transformation wasn't primarily about being conquered by external forces. It was fundamentally an internal failure to sense, adapt, and integrate in the face of a shifting reality. Complacency and rigidity in a dynamic world are deadly.
And the real power here, maybe, is that these frameworks aren't just descriptive tools for historians. They become diagnostic tools that you, the listener, can potentially use right now.
Exactly. They offer a way to think systemically about our current situation. You can use the river of reality concept to sort of map out our own contemporary flows. Where are the blockages or distortions? Is our flow of information corrupted by mis and disinformation? Is our flow of connection fragmenting due to polarization? Is our flow of hierarchy generating trust or cynicism? How is extreme economic inequality, commerce flow, impacting social cohesion and political stability, governance flow? It helps you ask structured questions.
And the fortress framework helps you look for blind spots.
Yes. You can use the fortress and shifting sands lens to assess our own society's potential for calcification and blindness. Are our key systems, political, economic, educational, cultural, primarily optimized for a world that maybe doesn't fully exist anymore? Are we collectively failing to sense crucial shifts in the global environment, whether that's climate change, technological disruption like AI, or changing geopolitical alignments? Are we too stuck inside our own fortress walls, unwilling to look out or adapt?
It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions about adaptation.
It does. And the crucial concluding thought from the editorial and from the frameworks themselves is about those windows and the courage to act. It's not enough to just have sensors or gather data.
You have to be willing to look.
You have to be willing to look, to really see what's happening outside, even if it's comfortable or challenges your assumptions. And then you need the courage and the agency to act on that information, to make necessary changes to the internal structures of the fortress, even if those changes are difficult or disrupt established routines and power structures.
And that links right back to that idea of consciousness from the river framework, doesn't it? Our human capacity for self-reflection, for using philosophical wisdom to understand our situation and make intentional collective choices about how to steer the flows. We aren't necessarily doomed to just repeat Rome's patterns if we can become aware of them.
That's the hope embedded in this kind of analysis. Understanding Rome's systemic vulnerabilities through these lenses provides, as the source says, an invaluable framework for diagnosing the health of our own complex society. It empowers you, the listener, to think more critically and systemically about the world around you, to spot potential dangers of calcification, and perhaps to identify areas where conscious adaptation and change are most needed.
So, quite a journey. We've used the river of reality to see how Rome built its complex civilization through interconnected flows, layer upon layer. And we've used the fortress and the shifting sands to reinterpret its fall, not as a simple collapse, but as a profound systemic failure to sense and adapt to a world undergoing fundamental change.
And through that process, hopefully we've uncovered some timeless patterns about how complex systems thrive, how they become vulnerable, and why adaptation, fueled by awareness, is so utterly critical for long-term survival. Lessons that echo powerfully from ancient Rome right into our lives today.
And the hope is that by understanding these dynamics, seeing reality as these interconnected flows, recognizing the danger of the optimized fortress becoming blind to the shifting sands, it gives you a new lens, a more powerful way to perceive and perhaps even interact with the complex systems you navigate every single day.
It definitely encourages looking beneath the surface events to understand the deeper currents and structures at play.
Which leaves us with a final, quite personal thought for you to take away and maybe reflect on, drawn directly from this analysis. How are you making sure that your own personal fortresses, maybe your habits, your routines, your deeply held beliefs, the way your team or organization works, how are you making sure they have windows? And maybe the tougher question, are you actually looking through them? Are you willing to see the ways the world is shifting out there, even when it's uncomfortable? And are you ready, truly ready, to adapt based on what you see?